Everyone, welcome to CamCOP 2026, CamCOP Rooted. This is the flagship conference of the Cambridge Climate Society. It's the second annual iteration this year. One could say the Cambridge Climate Society is the largest environmental society, student society in Cambridge. I'd like to think it's the largest society in the university, but maybe that's a bit of a boast. Maybe it's a bit inflated. And Nick will also introduce the society. He's our president momentarily. We're also very grateful to be supported by all the sponsors you see on the banner there: Cambridge Zero, the Department of Geography, the Department of Plant Sciences, Wolfson College's Sustainability and Conservation Hub, and the Student Union as well. So thank you to those organizations for sponsoring us. CamCOP has two elements in the name, Cam and COP. Cam is Cambridge. It's our centre of excellence, centre of study and thinking. And also today, you'll see particularly lots of localized elements to Cambridge in the discussions. And COP, of course, relates to the climate negotiations facility at the international level. Really, CamCOP is about finding the flaws and deficiencies in that process and seeing how we can remedy them. So last year at CamCOP Decolonized, we looked at how neo-colonial power structures still shape climate action today, and we tried to forefront global South voices in the conversation. This year, we're looking at how the anthropocentric paradigm, that is the human interest paradigm, still dictates how we think about the climate. And we're looking in the converse at nature-based solutions as a remedy to that paradigm. Briefly, the run of events. So we've got two panels today, one at 10 o'clock, one at 1:30. You're very welcome to both. And then we have our roundtable at 4 o'clock and a networking reception at 6 o'clock. So please, you're very welcome to all of those. Tomorrow we have two more panels and an additional roundtable at the same times. You can find on Luma all of the details of the various events. And today we've got panel one to start the day. Panel one is our conservation and ecosystems panel. And we're very grateful to have a very wide range of excellent panelists to discuss the issues. Briefly, just a bit of housekeeping. There's a fire door there and one at the back, so we're not expecting a fire test, but if that does occur, those are the exits. And if you need the toilet, feel free to slip out. It's basically down the corridor, you turn right and continue, and it will be on your right. If you need any logistical assistance, there'll be lots of volunteers and officers floating around, so feel free just to ask one of us. With that said, I should have introduced myself. My name is Caden. I'm one of the Society Vice Presidents, and I've been helping organize this conference. And it's a pleasure, a real pleasure and a privilege to have you all here today. And I'll hand over to Nick.
Thank you so much, Caden, for this wonderful introduction. Good morning, everyone. My name is Nicholas. I'm the Society's President. And I just wanted to welcome all of you very briefly. CamCOP is CCS flagship conference. Caden just mentioned that. We've done this last year, we're doing it again this year, and we're hoping to continue this into the future. It's becoming one of our biggest events and most impactful events that we're putting on every single year. So we're very proud that we're able to convene such an esteemed panel of experts, not just today, but over the next 4 sessions and 2 roundtables that we're hosting. Grounding these sorts of conversations, which are becoming more and more difficult during these times. I'm not sure if any of you saw, for example, the biodiversity report that the government just published a couple of weeks back. It's increasingly important, and that's why this theme was chosen, rooted, to reground ourselves in some sort of social space, in some sort of researched and expert-guided conversations to make sure that we're having these discussions in a manner that is actually productive and gets us moving forward. CCS, and just a small kind of plug on what we do before we get started. CCS is all about connecting people and creating spaces like this. So we're just incredibly grateful to be able to work with the partners who have sponsored and generally supported us today and tomorrow, which includes Cambridge Zero, the Department of Plant Sciences, the Department of Geography, the Wolfson Research Initiative, as well as the Student Union. Thank you so much for your support. And we're also working and hosting this event in partnership with the Cambridge Climate Week, which is an exciting initiative which is happening next week with an incredible array of events happening all across the city. Another initiative that we've started to bring together loads of different actors across the city. And we're just grateful to see it actually coming together. With that being said, thank you so much to the organizers. to Kaden and Johanna specifically, to all the officers who've put so much work into putting these panels on, to all our speakers and moderators, who I'm sure we're going to see brilliantly discuss these topics over the next couple of hours, and to all of you for joining us today, both in person and online. If you can't make any of the sessions in person over the weekend, but you want to rewatch something, do check out our live stream that we're hosting. And that being said, thank you so much for being here, and I'll hand over to Hannah for the panel. Thank you so much.
Well, may I invite the speakers to the panel? Okay, everyone. So welcome to the Conservation and Ecosystems panel. I'm so pleased to be here and see such a variety of speakers with us, which I will talk about in a second. So yes, biodiversity is declining across the globe, which is caused in great proportion by human-induced climate change. According to a recent UN's report, 1 million animal and plant species are currently threatened with extinction within decades. A study from 2021 showed that only 3% of Earth's land remains ecologically intact, with a healthy population of all of its original animals and undisturbed habitat. This supports more common view that we're facing a sixth mass extinction event in the history of our planet, which this time is caused by human action. So current extinction rates are between 100 and 1,000 times higher than the background extinction rates, which is very, very sad. And personally, as I work with primate species, it was so hard to come to the realization that 60% of primate species are facing anthropologically driven extinction, and 75% of primate species are currently declining populations. So we are no longer in a position where simple conservation is enough, and we must move towards active restoration. So to focus our efforts, scientists try to predict resilience of different ecosystems by assessing the exposure, so how much the local climate changes, the sensitivity, so how much a species can tolerate, and adaptive capacity, so how much species can move or evolve to adapt to the changing climate. So scientists use digital twins and next generation modeling to simulate the development of the situation and find solutions and weak points. And it's really nice to see how modern ecology is becoming a systems biology in a sense, which is really nice. So recent focus in the field has also been towards nature-based solutions, which will be a little bit of a focus of this panel. And nature-based solutions are ones that try to protect nature from climate change, but at the same time utilizing solutions that are already in nature, so hoping to also fix it and give it more resilience. So nature-based solutions are implemented for mitigation. So for example, creating carbon sinks by restoring peatlands and mangroves and seagrasses that are often more efficient at storing CO2 than rainforests. And they're also used for adaptation. So for example, instead of building concrete walls at the sea, we would restore coral reefs and mangroves to be more resilient toward storm surges. Or in cities, you would build more green roofs and city forests to act as natural cooling agents to prevent the heat island effects. So this is the sort of solutions that people are working on and trying to implement and thinking about. So today I'll be welcoming a specialist across the scales and the fields, which is so nice to have such a diversity of voices. So we'll be hearing from people from with both international conservation experience and people focusing their efforts on local communities and local ecosystems. We will talk to scientists who are concerned with the smallest scale, from viruses and stem cells, to people looking at the level of societies, urban agglomerations, and whole ecosystems. We will also talk to people who are tuning into the humans, who are tuning into the animals, and the interactions between natural and built environments. So all of that to give you plenty of points of view on the state of ecosystems and the conservation methods today. So let me welcome our panelists. We have Charlie Gardner today, who's an interdisciplinary conservation scientist, communicator, and activist. His work focuses on how societies respond to the intertwined climate change and biodiversity crises. He spent a decade working in Madagascar with organizations such as WWF, helping to implement the country's Durban Vision to dramatically expand its protected areas, and researching how conservation can go hand in hand with local development. Apart from being an academic, he also writes for The Guardian and The Conservation, and works with NGOs to advance practical ecosystems protection. Sounds very good. Well, we also welcome Ian Webb, who has 25 years of conservation experience around Cambridge. He's part of the Wildlife Trust for Bedfordshire, Cambridgeshire, and Northamptonshire, and with extensive experience in habitat management and community conservation. We have Timo Koel, who's a biochemist and stem cell biologist researching mammalian development originally. He has spent a lot of time in Cambridge and currently still here, but also he has his own lab at the University Medical Center, Hamburg-Eppendorf. Despite being focused in his research on mammalian development, at heart, I think Timo is interested in how discoveries in stem cell and genomic technologies can be translated into conservational toolkit, enabling new approaches to safeguard endangered species and ecosystems. Professor James Wood, who's an Alborda professor of equine and farm animal sciences at Cambridge. He's an infectious disease epidemiologist, and his research focuses on One Health approaches to the investigation of disease emergence. He looks at the ecology and emergence of RNA viruses from fruit bats in Ghana and control of bovine tuberculosis in Ethiopia in the UK. And he also published on zoonosis in sub-Saharan Africa and chairs the Cambridge African Strategic Advisory Group. We also welcome Yair Peri, who has an MPhil in Engineering for Sustainable Development from Cambridge University, and his academic work focuses on green infrastructure and the role of nature-based solutions in building climate-resilient cities. So he's part of the water-sensitive Cambridge, where he contributes to community-led responses to regions' growing water challenges and explores how ecological design can support both people and the ecosystems. So thank you. Oh, sorry. Thank you all for coming, and we'll start with some questions. I thought it would be good to start with a general overview of what do you think are the critical issues facing ecosystems presently? How did we get here? Like what led us to those issues, and how do you see the situation developing?
Well, I can thank you. I can talk a little bit about the main threats to ecosystems. Conservation science is the academic discipline that addresses threats to ecosystems. And when this field was in its infancy in the 80s, there was a guy called Norman Myers who identified 4 principal threats to nature. He called these the 4 horsemen of extinction. The first one, and the main one, is the destruction of ecosystems, the conversion of ecosystems into a different form. And this happens primarily because of agricultural expansion. The second big threat is the overexploitation of species. So, for example, with overfishing. Then we have the problem of invasive species, which mess up the interactions within ecosystems. And then the fourth one that Norman Myers identified was called cascading extinctions, cascading effects. So, every species is linked to others. So when the dodo went extinct, for example, it would have had some species of feather mites that only lived on the dodo, and they went extinct immediately. But there were also some species of trees whose seeds are dispersed by dodos, and they become rarer as a result. So these are the four traditional losses of the four traditional threats to biodiversity. More recently, there are two new ones, one of which is pollution of plastic pollution, novel chemicals, and then the other is climate change. And climate change is perhaps growing into the biggest threat of all to ecosystems. I perhaps will have a chance to speak about that in more detail later on, but I'll pass on.
Whatever Charlie said was quite good. I think one of the things for me is obviously the destruction of habitat is the fundamental, but that's sort of the big grained aspect. If you see forests disappearing or grasslands being lost, but for me, I think in my experience, being in love with nature for most of my life, is seeing the fine scale disappearing as well, and that's where chemical usage, agricultural chemicals really, knocks out the base of these food pyramids that we're reliant on. So for hundreds of years in this country, we adapted the landscape for our own ends, and it just so happened a lot of the species coped with that. Our management of habitats emulated features that naturally existed. But when we started using chemicals in our farming, that really knocked out all those flower-rich meadows, all those pollinating insects, all those sort of things. So for me, it's reiterating that importance of chemical usage, novel chemical usage, because it knocks out the stuff that can cope with what we've done to it so far. Obviously, when deforestation is major, but certainly talking from my experience in this country and seeing the habitats and understanding the history of ecology in this country, it's that industrialization of agriculture which is the major issue. And as well, locally, water. That's the other major thing. So, yeah, nicking your thunder, but that is a major, and that's going to become more and more of an issue. Well, it's an issue for vast areas of the country, of the world already, not just for humans, but more, directly towards the ecosystem species, etc. So yeah, agree with Charlie, but adding a bit more detail for me.
Thank you. Yeah, we just heard a little bit. I mean, myself, I'm already really at the end of, when it's almost too late for the species. And we just heard a little bit about cascading effects. And I think one of the things that now also has always played a role, but plays more and more of a role, is the loss of genetic diversity within populations, right? So, for example, if we have cascading effects or if we have climate change, the species would need to adapt, of course, to a variety of new challenges. And on an evolutionary time scale, things are changing so fast at the moment. Well, they have many times, but it's especially now that many of these threatened populations actually can't keep up anymore and are not even given the time to evolve, to basically themselves fight off new emerging threats. And this is a little bit where our work, I guess, comes in trying to understand if there's anything that can be done to mitigate those effects. So I think, yeah, on the level of genetics, which is maybe a little bit more on the nerdy side of things, we also have now emerging threats that do or threaten these populations at risk.
Thanks. So my work more focuses on the consequences of biodiversity loss in relation to infectious disease emergence, rather than looking at the kind of trying to stop the root drivers of this biodiversity loss. And I believe that although the evidence is not yet strong, it's growing for biodiversity loss being particularly important for things like future pandemics. I think it's worthwhile taking a step back and thinking about what the drivers, what we can do about the drivers of biodiversity loss. We talked about agriculture being a key driver. That's very different in different parts of the world. In terms of how that works and how that impacts, and I think it's so. Just to take the example of what has happened in a lot of Amazonia, a lot of that loss of pristine rainforest, pristine in recent years at least, recent centuries, that has been driven by both beef and by soya production, and although soy production has been linked with things other than just straight agriculture. The major use of soya now from Brazil is for food for chickens and for pigs. Not so much in Brazil, but including in Brazil. And actually the global production of pigs and chickens relies to a huge extent in both China, which is one of the major areas for animal protein production, but also all across Europe. Most protein, most soy protein comes from Brazil. So a lot of people who are saying, I produce my pigs very, very well here, I'm not contributing to this global biodiversity loss, actually are often doing it in a way that they don't realise through their use of that, which is not necessary. I think just another area which is outside of my work, but part of an area I'm passionate about, which is about indigenous people's rights. I think it's really important to recognise the unintended consequences of how we are adapting our world to try and deal with climate change. And one of the big tools that we're using for this is batteries. Batteries have an insatiable thirst for nickel, in particular, and cobalt. And nickel mining is becoming one of the most destructive means of destroying pristine habitats. One of the best examples of that is some of the nickel mining going on in parts of Indonesia at the moment, which are displacing an uncontacted set of peoples, the Hongana Manyana, and there's huge amounts of information available on this, but European firms are driving this. In particular, some companies in France are driving this. Interestingly, although in many respects I think that the role of Elon Musk as arch global terrorist is a fair one, Tesla has been one of the few companies in this space that have said that they will not mine or use nickel mined from the lands of uncontacted peoples. Whereas there are French companies, and the Guardian actually covered this quite nicely, this specific area quite nicely in a long read piece, I think last weekend. There's a huge amount of information available on this, and we're still just sitting there doing it and buying our batteries from whichever company, whether it's France or somewhere else, because our car then is slightly cheaper than the one that and I'm not trying to recommend people buy Teslas, all right, but the point is we're doing a lot of this stuff because these supply chains are so distant from our day-to-day lives that we are contributing to this biodiversity loss, sometimes when we think we're trying to do the right thing. And I think this is where much less opacity in supply chains and much more realization of the consequences of so many of the ways that we live, I think is a really important thing. Thank you.
So I think, the unsustainable land use change is really what's driving everything, and we always focus on carbon, but it is affecting biodiversity, and it's affecting it in a lot of places because it changes the water cycle. So with land use change, you get, if you take away a forest, there's less infiltration, so the groundwater is losing it. Water is then, you get more runoff, which also carries all the chemicals and pollution that comes with agriculture. And when you take away the trees, you actually, there's a study that came out, I think 2 weeks ago, that showed that the Amazon, actually, what it generates most is rain. So it's not even the carbon of the trees, but it's the trees are creating rain. And when you take away the trees, you get less rain. And so it's really, if we look at the water cycle, it's actually one of the drivers that changes biodiversity, changes the way species can survive, whether it is out in the country or in the urban areas. So I think that's where we put our focus on.
Sorry to have another go. Everybody else can have just one of the major things, actually, hearing what was just said, capitalism is the major problem. But also, that's an obvious thing, and psychological impacts of people's experience of life, and ego and greed, that's a major part of it. And we are very privileged. We're privileged being up here, white males, top of the privilege tree. and being in a Western country, we are privileged, you know. Not saying everybody in our society is privileged. Anyway, so capitalism, that's the big thing, which is the major driver, and we're all part of it. We're all part of capitalism. You know, we're all hypocritical, we're all responsible. But going back to more natural senses, soils is the key thing. And we only recently realised how immensely important soils are for all biodiversity on the planet. And if you lose that, you've lost, you know, and it's more about all these things are important, but it's highlighting those things which are more recently discovered, and soil loss, damage, destruction is a major one as well.
Just another quick follow-up, because what I realized when we all spoke, everybody used the word biodiversity very quickly, and when at least I was invited, we talked a lot about the climate change, right? And I was like, oh, maybe that's not quite my expertise, and I love that it's already being connected directly, because often for me personally, I see it being portrayed as two different issues, right? One is climate change and one is biodiversity, and clearly from just now this tiny little round of people, everybody very much connects them, and I hope maybe in the future this will be also covered and portrayed more as well. These are not separate issues, they are very much intertwined, and you can't choose one or the other. So I think that's a positive thing.
Yes, so I think as ecosystems and climate are all very interconnected, we tapped into those key things, aspects of those systems that underline and coordinate all of them together, like water and soil. I was wondering if you would want to maybe think about what are the most key aspects of this massive system that we could interact with, and what are the most dominant approaches now to help conserve that in its most natural form as possible.
Say me when I've said too much. Involving the locals, I think, is a key thing. We were talking earlier about, I can't remember where it was, you know, conservation, nature conservation has done a lot, hasn't done enough for nature, but it's impacted indigenous peoples enormously. The colonial idea of kicking people off their lands to preserve it is completely wrong. And that needs to change. So even in my role in nature conservation in South Cambridgeshire, if you engage with people locally, you can get so much done. I run a volunteer team, and one of the team is with us today, and involving local people to be engaged in positive solutions to the situation faced is the most important thing, because if you don't get people on board, it's not going to work. So that, for me, as a first thought of that, is getting people involved, getting all you people involved locally to feel that responsibility, but also that positive impact that you can have as an individual working collectively, the agency that people have lost in their ability to change things for the better, to re-engage with that and know that you have such an important part to play in reversing this. Not reversing, but impacting it in a positive way.
Just to follow up on what Ian was saying, so our main approach to conserving nature traditionally has been to set aside areas as parks and reserves when nature is protected. And there's a lot good about that approach. We do need to protect the most valuable places and the few remaining wild places we have. But there are a lot of issues with this approach too. One that Ian hinted at is that it creates this symbolic and actual sort of separation between people and nature. It creates this idea that nature is this thing that we can just have in some places, and then on the remaining 90% of the world, we don't need nature because we've protected it over there. It's of course highly, highly dangerous to conceive of ourselves as separate from nature, because that makes us, it makes society treat nature as a nice to have, like the cherry on top, and nature and society does treat nature as a cherry on top. So the creation of protected areas has been a huge success. Nearly 15% of the Earth's land surface is now managed in parks and reserves. The total global spending on managing those parks and reserves is less than what we spend globally on ice cream. It's a third of what we spend globally on ice cream. So this idea that it's just a separate thing is really dangerous, because it makes us feel that it's not essential. Sorry, I'm waffling.
I think both those things that were just said are fantastic, and I see myself a little bit as an outsider, right? I studied biochemistry, and for the longest time, I did not even see how to be involved at all. And when you said bring in people, I think it's also very much bring in people across disciplines. And what I encountered in the beginning, there was certainly an aspect of, I don't know what I want to call gatekeeping, but the conservation community itself, as I learned, they don't all have the same opinion, clearly, and there's very different aspects and approaches to it. But I think we're now at a point where reaching out across divides and across disciplines can be extremely helpful. And as an example, I would, for example, say, well, synthetic biology. The other day I was invited to talk about synthetic biology and the use of conservation science. Yeah, might be useful, definitely a controversial topic, but you can, from my point of view, bring in new people from different departments that have interest, because it's not just this, what you just said, nice to have, right? And I think many of us might have this, I don't know what it is, ethical feeling, it's a correct thing to do, and there's probably a lot more to it. And I think you mentioned earlier the government report, which is, are you referring to the national security assessment that just came out? Which is funny, because it's a completely different angle, right? It has nothing to do with, a cute polar bear or anything. It's very much, well, actually, in this case, the UK is at risk due to biodiversity loss for the existence of the UK as a state, pretty much. And I think those all go very much hand in hand, and we have now the ability to bring in new technologies, and we should probably think about them now, because I don't know who said earlier, 1 million species are at risk. I'm currently preparing a lecture for the use of stem cell technologies in biodiversity or conservation aspects. And you can scroll back and you read a piece in the New York Times in, 1980, where they say, scientists call out 1 million species at risk. And it's a bit shocking, because now we're in 2026, and the headlines do not change much. You would hope something has changed, but really hasn't. So I think a combination of those two aspects you just mentioned, bring in people across the divides, locally, internationally, because unfortunately biodiversity is of course not just a local issue, and you can't just do one thing here and it will affect or won't affect anything somewhere else. Is going to be a large challenge for all of us over the next decades, especially if you read the headlines and news these days. But hopefully times will be better again at some point, maybe.
I just want to touch on the traditional model of protected areas, which have been fantastic in many respects. I think some of the first protected areas, big-scale protected areas, are the national parks of the USA. These were created to conserve areas by white men like us, and we're all a little bit uncomfortable, I think, about the diversity of this panel.
I'm here, thankfully.
The invited members. These parks were created by removing First Nations people from those areas. They are, as has been said already, we are part of biodiversity, and they are an entirely artificial construct. And I think it's really important to recognise that model for protected area production is being carried on today. And you can pick organisations such as nearly all of the major global conservation organisations have a role in removing people from the land in order to conserve them. From African parks across the continent they work in, WWF, which is like Cameroon, Frankfurt Conservation, the Frankfurt Zoo, the Zoological Society, in particular in Tanzania. There are so many of these programs ongoing where indigenous peoples are being removed from their lands at the moment in the name of conservation. And I think that we can see the positive aspects of the really old conserved areas in the USA, but they're not really the natural land without the people on there. And some of the most aggressive and nasty removal operations are going on at the moment in Tanzania, where huge amounts of Middle Eastern money is being put into to conservation areas to allow people from the Middle East to come and hunt at the expense of the Maasai transhuman herders there, who have been there for hundreds of years, if not longer. And so that, let's talk about conservation areas positively, but let's try and do them right, and not have the fortress conservation model of organisations like African Parks with their armed guards throwing locals out, stopping them traditionally living in the forests that they've always lived in. And let's do it well, not badly. And so I think with all of the changes that we're trying to introduce and the nature-friendly approaches to conservation and addressing climate change, let's try and do it in a way that there aren't obvious unintended consequences. Sometimes, we will do things that have unintended consequences that we don't want, but when we know that we shouldn't be doing this, I think globally, then let's try and change the way we do it.
So this is a bit depressing for a Saturday morning. But I just want to say, in terms of the panel, my co-founder for Water Sensitive Cambridge, Clara, is over there. So I wasn't chosen to speak just because of my sex. And it's, the issues that you're outlining, they're so big and daunting, and it's like, where do you start? And I think that's what sort of made us start Water Sensitive Cambridge. It's like, let's start locally. We know the problems in sub-Saharan Africa. Not much we can do right now, but what if, we redirect downpipes so they don't go down the drain? And it's like a simple thing that you can do right here, everyone in their own garden. Right now we're doing it in schools, so it's about showing from kids, showing people how things can be different. And I think there isn't like a one big solution. We're not going to solve this, not with the technology and not with this giant operation. So it will be a solution of many different solutions. And maybe the cascading effects that are happening now in the negative way, we can have a positive cascading effect, and that's where we should go. And bringing back nature is really the easiest thing you can do to start the change. And it can start with your own garden, or it can start with your college.
It's great. Go to.
I like the positive aspect here in very much, but I completely agree, and I think the power of these I don't know, maybe grassroots organization, or whatever you want to call it, but very small local initiatives is sometimes overseen, just because of course if you look at them individually, it's a very small local effect, and especially also for, I think, the students now in the room, if you start something, it might feel like, well, what good is that going to do? But I can just speak from my own field, of course. The use of if you're interested in stem cells, it doesn't matter, across species right now, right? For preserving genetic diversity, that was not really ever a topic even 10 years ago. And suddenly there's more and more groups, and Hannah, for example, is one of them, that are driving these efforts globally, right? Where there's individuals that are very much interested in it, and if they start connecting, maybe at some point we will, of course, have bigger impact, because I think the issue is any of these aspects or topics you just said, of course, if you want to have a global policy across countries, it's complicated and takes probably years, if not decades, of negotiations, and then still mostly one country will not agree to them. So I think, not underestimate the power of the individual or individuals in small communities and groups.
I just have a really nice example that's quite pertinent to us here of the power of individual action. So Cambridge University has a sustainable food policy, as well as taking beef and unsustainably caught fish off menus in university outlets. They've also had efforts to promote plant-based items through more attractive marketing and things like this. And this is really important because it shows leadership. in society. You know, everybody's heard that we all need to change our diets and move towards plant-based diets. But when you don't see anybody doing anything about it, well, you think, well, it can't be that important if nobody's doing anything about it. But when you see an organization as important and respected as the University of Cambridge, it sends this social signal that this is important, we need to do it. It also has knock-on impacts on supply chains and all these things. Well, how did Cambridge University's it also normalizes plant-based eating. So, you know, people get an opportunity to taste good food, and it just normalizes it. It becomes normal. But how did this sustainable food policy in this important institution come about? Well, there was a professor of zoology, Andrew Balmford. His research revealed the need to shift to more plant-based diets for the purposes of conserving nature globally, as we've talked about in the Amazon. So he just set about making changes in his own institution. He got together with the head of catering, and they just did it. All of us are members of institutions. All of us live somewhere. We're part of neighborhoods. You know, I'm an activist. I like to go to the seat of power and demonstrate on the street. But all of us have these circles of influence where we can affect change in the world around us. We don't have to change the world, we just have to change the world around us. And when we do that, it's not just the case that it has direct impacts on reducing biodiversity loss or reducing carbon emissions. The real value of that is the social impacts, the demonstration effect. Because when people start taking something seriously, other people start taking it seriously too.
Just as a note from a student at the University of Cambridge, it was not so easy for the university or colleges to actually incorporate those policies, and students also have been fighting for it a lot. Through the Plant-Based University Society, we have a alternative protein society, and students within their colleges have also put a lot of effort to put the catering to serve a lot of plant-based alternatives, which it's not that only professors have the power here, we can also do something, and it's a lovely example.
I just want to add a stupid anecdote to the. I mean, Andrew's driven this whole program in a way, and it's become normalised, which is so important for all the reasons you describe. We work on avian influenza in this country as well. As part of my work, I have a PhD student who works on improving biosecurity on farms to stop. This is obviously chicken farms and turkey farms mostly, to stop them getting avian influenza, which by any way is bad waste. And we had Penny's ran an amazing workshop that we ran at Churchill College, and we didn't know any of the chicken farmers coming, and the big business people coming to this workshop. We really didn't want to bother asking about their dietary preferences. So, as a default, without having really thought it through, we provided them with a vegan lunch. And so we had a bunch of chicken farms. Well, let me tell you, that didn't go down very well. And it's thankfully Churchill were able to quell the unrest by producing some chicken sandwiches as well, in order to make people happy. But it's I think you have to pick your audiences in a way that Andrew did locally, really, really effectively. But I think it's it's a story of no consequence. But it's that there are times where it's easier to do this than others.
Can I just say, as we're talking about the the university, prestige is another aspect between colleges of wanting to show a set of one-upmanship, if you want to put it bluntly. Biodiversity, I know, is I heard something a couple of years ago about, it's almost like, this is a corporate aspect of my job, is certain businesses, nationally and internationally, are looking more at biodiversity now, because carbon is sort of seen as yesterday's news, and people are looking at biodiversity now. And it's that one-upmanship of being the best at preserving biodiversity, whether it's, which can be quite a negative situation to be, but at the moment, it's tempering that with understanding that it's people's egos that are impacted there, rather than actually wanting to do something for the greater good. But, get them through the door first, and then you can start changing minds as to why they're doing it, not purely to look better than the other competition. So, there's multiple ways of getting people to change, whether it be through encouraging, through feeling part of something, competitiveness, or just really sometimes shaming is a really valuable way of doing things. Not everybody can cope with that. I think, followed Charlie's Blue Sky, he put something up a couple of days ago about, you know, our society globally can't deal with shame or acceptance of we are responsible for where we are now. But that doesn't work with everybody. Anyway, it's a good article, you should read it. So anyway, there's multiple ways of dealing with this situation, and whatever you feel comfortable with or feel you can impact that way is do it. But the most important thing is do it. It might not work. It's a big thing, but it's better to do something and fail, because if you don't do it, you definitely fail. And it's far more enjoyable to do stuff, because it's really sociable, and you meet lovely people like these. And engage and be human, and then, you know, we're sociable, so we should be talking, even if we don't agree.
But at least the colleges don't eat swan anymore.
Right, we covered very nicely how there are solutions on like a very private kind of what can you do with your own space level. We covered the kind of mid-scale solutions, like get involved in your institution, maybe try to change something. And there's very big like national, international level. So would you be able to comment like how does an individual, how can you get involved in those like mid and kind of high, big scale initiatives to actually make some changes?
Obviously, this is a big plug, but join local conservation organisations. You know, that is how you impact things. I'm no shame to say I am happy to take your details, and you can be informed about the Wildlife Trust locally, what we do, how you can involve with that. Speak to me in the break, and I'll put some literature out at the back for you to read about the work we do, etc. But being engaged in local organisations such as the Wildlife Trust is one way of impacting locally, regionally, and nationally. You know, we are a federation of 46 trusts. There's no escape. Wherever you live in Britain, you can join the Wildlife Trust. And, you know, we have over 800,000 members. Our CEO of the Royal Society for the Wildlife Trust, is sort of the umbrella organisation, Craig Bennett, is very engaged, very active. And, you know, if he can say, oh, I've got 800,000 plus another 30 people from today involved in this organisation, then, you know, policymakers listen. They only care about staying in power, if I can be so blunt. And if lots of people want them to change things, they will change things. You know, I think I've drifted off a bit slightly. But, you know, I think just feel that you can engage, whether it be financially, there's financial involvement, volunteer involvement, and advocacy. You know, any organisation is really key. But grassroots, if you look at international, grassroots are the major ones. They are really fantastic and strong and do so much work because they realise they need to engage with the locals.
I think one of the things is for the students maybe as well, or the ones that are maybe not studying something directly connected to it and you're interested, don't give up, because it takes a while to hear back, as I learned personally, and using the negative words, but you kind of have to harass/bully your way in. You know, if you don't get a response within 3 emails, send another one. I think the issue is often people are just very busy in their day-to-day life with all kinds of things. So if you want to get involved, I mean, if you single out a person or an organization, just follow up. And normally, if it's clear that you're actually interested in it, because I mean, most of us, if we find people that are interested in similar topics, we like to talk to them, we want to work with them, and it does help. And even here within Cambridge, right, before I heard once back from Cambridge Conservation Initiative or Conservation Institute, it took a while. And we wrote a piece on stem cell technologies for biodiversity, and was like, well, shouldn't we talk to somebody who has built a career on this, and not just some STEM scientist that work on stem cells having very little idea maybe about what else is being used. And so I think that's one of the things, especially because you said how to get involved more on a grander level. And honestly, for me, I'm still figuring out how all the big organizations actually work and how policies are being put in place. And I think what you just said, normally it is, well, you get involved in a smaller level, and at some point there will be representatives of those organizations at international level. And I think, for example, the IUCN policy on synthetic biology that was published fall last year, I think. I heard about it in the news. I think The Guardian probably wrote about it as well. And I had no idea of how something like this is even being implemented, because such a large scale, international, and I had the luck of now meeting through one of those events pretty much the chief scientist of IUCN, and they had, I mean, it's a long, year-long process, right? And in the end, it was, actually I knew several of the organizations that were involved, because you don't see them anymore. Of course, if IUCN publishes any policy or IUCN paper, because they might be hidden somewhere in the small print, but a lot of local organizations are involved. So I think it's a very good idea to start somewhere where you might know somebody, you know, or if you have any other connections, to get involved there and work your way up in a way. Because of course, if you email UN biodiversity, you will probably hear very little back, because you know, if they have an email address. That might be a good way of starting.
So as members of academic institutions, I think we tend to have quite a naive view of how social change happens. Because we do research, we tend to think of environmental problems and societal problems as information deficit problems. What we need to solve these problems is more information, and if we, the scientific community, provide the information to society's decision makers, then of course they will use that information to make wise decisions in the public good. But that's not how policy making works, because policy is a contested space. It's not just the case that decision makers listen to scientists. There are also other people in the room that don't want them to adopt evidence-based policies. So, climate change is the classic example of this. The fossil fuel industry has systematically worked to prevent the adoption of the legislation and other systemic changes that the science demonstrates are needed. So when it comes to biodiversity loss, we've got exactly the same thing. We, the scientific community, have generated untold, irrefutable evidence for the need for transformative change to our global economic systems. But that transformative change will come at the price of the profitability of many of the world's largest industries. Fossil fuels, big beef, other forms of industrial agriculture, agrochemicals, aviation, motoring, construction, mining, all these things derive their profitability, at least in part, from the destruction of biodiversity. Oh yeah, industrial fishing, logging. And the thing is, these industries use their power to prevent government change. And they do it in two ways. They do it most obviously through influencing political processes, donations, and lobbying. But they do it more subtly too by changing public narratives, by manipulating public understanding of scientific issues through outright science denialism, disinformation campaigns, greenwashing, all these things. And when we look at things in this way, we see that the fight for a sustainable world isn't about doing science. It's about power and influence. And sociologists are increasingly clear that the only way really we're going to overcome the power of these private vested interests is through building a counterpower by reaching social tipping points. So social power, people power. And that's how I frame my response to this emergency. I've stepped away from academia, and I now work with social movements because this is where I feel we can address this battle, and it is a battle, and we have opponents. And you can't win a battle unless you recognize that you're in one. And I think, for me, the most powerful thing that people can do as individuals, alongside their academic career, we still need the information, but it's not sufficient, is to build momentum towards these social tipping points by joining in with social movements.
We're also running out of time a little bit, so if you could keep it brief.
So I do a little bit of work around policy in the UK around animal disease control policy, and including some of the more contested animal disease related issues. And what Charlie's described is absolutely true in relation to often there's not a lack of evidence, but it's around recognising powers and power influences there. Just to answer your question very directly about how do you get involved in larger things, I'm going to very briefly describe how after witnessing some of the challenges of indigenous people in the year before I went around the world, in the year before I went to university, I was introduced to and then started to do some initially small-scale volunteering for Survival International, which in the early 80s was a small organisation supporting tribal people's rights. And over the 5 or 6 years of a veterinary degree, that turned into a day a week of me skipping classes for a day. And my involvement grew from there. I have then become a trustee of the organisation decades later. But I think that the point of trying to make is that just that was with no purpose other than just supporting the organisation. Starting locally on a small scale, if you want to influence stuff, is often the way to go, even if you're not. And probably if you're directed, you want to go and become a major player, but actually then I think that can be really effective. Or you could end up, not by default, but not necessarily out of purpose, playing a role in a major international organisation just through having done stuff for them for a long time.
So yeah, I think a personal voice is really what's like educating yourself, especially when we're talking about ecosystems and biodiversity. I mean, these are such messy problems. It's so easy to frame climate change on carbon and emissions and power. But if to understand that it's an ecosystem and to get that system thinking, to realize that small changes can create bigger ones, to understand that it's not just carbon. If you remove trees, you take away habitat, and you're changing the water cycle. And then you can be a voice for it, and you can explain it. And people will get tired of you because you keep bringing it up. And you're driving through the countryside, and it's now spring, and there's blossom, and everything is green, and you talk about biodiversity loss. It's like, what do you mean? Look outside, but maybe it's not what we should see outside the window. So it's really being there, and then, I mean, you'll find what it is that drives you most, and everything is important, right? From the stem cells to the jungle. So there's enough issues out there. You'll find.
Yes. So to summarize, I think everyone has a role to play, and you just have to start somewhere. So
maybe also one thing I think is still talk and listen both very much. Constantly, what you just said, people will get bored of you. Yeah, I guess there is an aspect of that at some point. But I feel like, especially from an academic point of view, the talking, especially in the beginning, if you're like, I might have an idea and maybe I will publish it, it doesn't work in this scenario. I think especially connecting different people is of important. I'm learning it myself as well, right? Because, of course, if you're very early in your career, you want to build your career, you need to actually find where you fit in. If you have done a whole career and you're close to retirement, at some point it might be easier because you have done it for your whole life. But especially in the beginning, I think if you know somebody personally that works on X and you talk to another person that works on Y and you think they should actually talk to one another, bring them together, right? I mean, there's never anything lost. And honestly, of course, maybe at some point people forget about you, but normally I think it helps you and your network will grow and you can build exactly these smaller scale impacts that can happen. And something unexpected might even come out of it, right? Initiatives that you had never thought about. And then listen as well, especially to the ones you don't want to listen to. I think that's sometimes tricky, but I feel like I know so little in general, especially as somebody who did not work in conservation or biodiversity or in my whole life, that my biggest fear is always to do something wrong. What if I actually work on something and I personally believe, yes, it's great and it will help, but actually it's bad. And so I think that is a very important aspect, to reach out to the people that you might not want to listen to because they just have opposing views, or the ones where they just know more. And I feel very much like an imposter even here right now, just because it's not my normal forte maybe, and expertise. So I think it's very helpful to find those people where you think you can learn something from them. Just ask them all the questions, because again, just like when you talk, you build new networks.
I think I might have to interrupt you. So I think we're going to have a short break, still 10 minutes. So we'll meet each other at like 11:20 back here for some questions from the audience for the panel. Thanks so much for all the discussion. warm up, I'll start with my own question. I'm also an audience. So I've been thinking about the 6 extinction events in our planet and how, it happened before in the history of life on Earth that we've had like 97% of species going. And then nature somehow finds a way to rejuvenate and to find new biodiversity involved, new ways to survive in the changing climate. So one could think that it's not actually nature that's going to be the sacrifice here, but humans and human society. So I was wondering whether you think whether it would be like beneficial for the community to kind of paint the picture more as humans being the ones losing out here, more than nature as a motivation like strategy for people.
I know nothing about this. So I think the point about, at the moment, humans are the major driver of most of the things bad that are happening in the world. And nature is suffering as a consequence. We are going to suffer because we're killing nature. And that's where we will be the beneficiaries of doing this in the long term, I think.
I suppose nature is an amazingly resilient thing as a collective of species, habitats. But for me, I think on a personal level, yeah, we're going to be suffering. But it's, in some respects, I don't want to sound too harsh, but it'll be all right if all the humans died out, because we caused the problem. But it's all the other beautiful, fantastic, intricate, amazing species that are coming down with us. That's what really cuts me up. If it was just us, that'd be, that's our fault. But everything hasn't, it's been getting on with its own life. Those parasitic wasps or things that live up the noses of dolphins, whatever it is. Those things have just been evolving and working together and creating this wonderful mutually understanding sort of relationship with each other. Obviously, the things eat each other, but it's just that sense of, it's so sad that all those things are going to disappear. Was it the Yangtze River dolphin, functionally extinct 4 years ago. Amazing softback turtles in Asia, virtually extinct. All these things which are beautiful and essential. I give this analogy, I give lots of talks. Ecosystem is like a plane. And on that plane, you have nuts and bolts. And on that ecosystem, you have species. If you fly along in a plane, lose a couple of nuts and bolts, it's fine. You're flying along, and it's okay. Same with an ecosystem. But you'll get that last bolt, you don't know which one it's going to be, that falls out of that plane, and it plummets. And that's what we are on this planet now. We're losing species. They might not be significant to us because they're small, and they're not like majestic whales or whatever, but we don't know which one is going to mean everything goes down. Temporarily for a few 100,000 years until nature responds, but is it worth it for our arrogance, really? That's the sad thing. All those beautiful things, they're disappearing. Working in conservation for 30 years, it's heart-rending. Every day I know I'll wake up and it's going to get worse. But it doesn't make me stop. I don't have hope, I have courage to do what's right. I always think, nature doesn't give up. I clear scrub from grassland with volunteers, it just keeps growing back. It doesn't go, I can't be bothered, what's the point? It just responds. Kestrels hovering by the side of a road don't think, I can't be bothered looking for small mammals on a day like today. They just they value life, and life is there to be lived and preserved and do what you can. And the key thing is know that you can impact. Each one of us have the privilege to have a positive impact on where we are. And don't say that's not true. I know what an individual can do positively. So yeah, nature is going to be fine. I feel really bad that loads of other species are going down the pan as well as us. But I'm going to do as much as I can to do the right thing for those species and for my daughters as well, I should say. I've got 2 beautiful daughters. So, yeah. It seems dire, but from despair comes action, and action is great. I get to talk to you, you listen to me, and the doors aren't locked, which is amazing. And knowing that we're sharing this difficult time together gives strength, hopefully, to individuals to do something about it.
Very nice, I like it. And that's actually what brought me in probably into this world of biodiversity initially. By now, and this might sound a bit controversial, but I sometimes, to the question, yes, I think we are the ones losing out. And for me, I adapt a little bit of who I talk to nowadays. A little bit what you just said earlier, I think about, well, maybe I should serve chicken to chicken farmers instead of a vegan dish. Because that's also what this government reported, right? They don't care personally about this species, and that the species is, I agree, beautiful and nice to look at and this nice to have of what we heard earlier. But there's actually, they describe it more as of an existential risk to our society. And I struggle with that, especially even the corporate aspect sometimes. But in the end, after having, well, in the process of preparing this lecture at the moment and reading through these old newspaper articles, we're like, okay, 1981 to 2026, things have changed, but in the end, the headlines still stay somewhat the same. So how can we bring in other parties? And in particular, when you said you have to recognize that we're in a fight to even fight the fight, right? I think that's true. But what I also don't want to end up myself in a situation where I don't even listen to other parties anymore, just because I think then probably we are getting even less done than before. So how can I actually make persuasive and convincing arguments that we should protect biodiversity, should care about the climate? And I think even from a corporate aspect, that sounds for many people odd, we are losing out, right? Biodiversity, let's say stem cell people again here, or drug discovery. There's so much potential out there in the world that we have not even touched upon or researched at all, is that we are losing out on so many different opportunities. And of course, maybe I would not use that as an argument right here in this room, but if I would talk, pharma executives, I would probably bring that up. And that's what I mean by, I try to adjust a little bit how I talk about the things I care, just because ethically, I think it's the right thing to do. And for your children, for example, and following generations, of course, but trying to adapt a little bit of the audience might be helpful to not make this divide even larger, because in the end, if we protect biodiversity, I think everybody benefits from it, whether it's for your personal well-being or for your corporate interests. And I do stand behind that. Maybe not if you're in oil business, I do not know. That's tricky. I have not figured out how to address that. But in general, I think that is extremely beneficial for everybody.
So like Ian, I love nature, and I'm really motivated. Ever since I was a young child, I've been really motivated to try and help other species. But I think this has been a bit of a strategic communication error from the conservation sector, because while that message of let's do it for the pandas, let's do it for the dolphins, that motivates 5% of society or whatever, and it's a very powerful message for us. But I think it's a dangerous message, because by saying let's do it for the pandas, you're saying the conservation of biodiversity is an altruistic quest to help other species, whereas the living world is our life support system. It could not be more important to human beings, and conservation of biodiversity is ultimately a deeply self-interested goal. And I think communicating that self-interest is really important. So, this national security report that we've been talking about is a wonderful example of framing biodiversity loss in a different way, that makes it appear, that makes its importance transparent and clear to other people. So I do strongly believe, I agree with you that we need to focus more on the social human benefits of conserving a living world. But I really strongly agree with Timo in that, there are 1,000 different reasons to conserve biodiversity. And so that's 1,000 different narratives. And there are 1 million different audiences, each with their own interests. and motivations. And, you know, there is no one narrative. The key is in listening, as we've discussed, understanding the interests of the people we're speaking to, and then framing our messages according to what interests them, rather than according to what interests us, which is doing it for the pandas and the dolphins.
Anything else?
So I think the connection between the humans and nature is something that obviously we need nature, but even for our lives, for, you know, when even people that are not connected to nature, when they travel, when they look for a good Instagram background, you know, when they travel, it's nature. It's like you want a nice waterfall, you want a nice tree, a flower. And so to get people out to nature already shows them that connection. I mean, when you take a walk in the woods, and it could be the park, it could be anywhere, you already feel it. And I think there's too many parts of our society that doesn't get that connection because they don't have nature next door to them, or they don't have the ability to travel out to nature. And I think once you're in there, and if you're not afraid of nature, then you can connect, and then you'll be more likely to act and to understand the connection.
Me again. Sorry, it is that sense of one of my roles is to show people nature, and it's such a privilege to do that. And that is how we change things, is get everybody to engage with nature on a personal level, but not through an app, not through a website, but face to face with somebody who can facilitate that relationship you can have with nature, because it is so powerful. I am so privileged to have that role. So yes, you know, send the message out big, but it really needs to be, to make real changes, to get as close as you can with people to nature. So education in a way that is not just something they can scroll past, so say, look, what's in your garden pond? See all the frogs spawn and stuff like that. That is how you get people to change. And that's how I know that that's how it can happen, by engaging with every one of you to go out and see nature, and you tell your mates, have you heard the cuckoo down at Wicken Fen? It's fantastic. And that's how you get people, you know, people are smiling, because that is what nature does. When you know what it's like to see a bat fly past, or hear a fox screeching in the middle of the night, it's just that visceral kind of, that is fantastic. And so yeah, it's a big message, and it's very difficult to hone it, but I think if you just get people out. Years ago, I was at Alconbury Airfield as a spy base for the US Air Force years ago, and I was doing an educational thing for the children on that, and the head colonel chappie came out, and I chatted to him, and you know, that was such a valuable thing, maybe more for me than for him, but just the ability to talk with people, because everybody is as valuable as each other, and obviously that head person had a certain responsibility given to him, but the children I was showing going sweep netting, that was really valuable as well. So it's any opportunity you get to engage with, you know, at lunch you go for a walk around the grounds and I'll show you some amazing wildlife that's just here now. You know, that's what the wonderful thing of nature is. It never lets you down, and I always talk too much.
I think that's necessary, but I'm not sure it's enough. And I think so we talked about kind of things that have changed, and there was a public health meeting yesterday where we were talking about how long it took to really get the societal recognition of the harms of smoking and tobacco. And you know, we're talking about decades there. And actually it's probably the best example of corporate industries misusing evidence, creating all of those things that you described over a long period, which I think I mean, whatever you think about vaping as an alternative is a different matter. But you know, I think that battle is almost won, at least in many parts of the world. But I think that we've got to combine all of that passion, that personal stuff, with legislation. And I think that you've got to tackle it from both ends if you really want to drive global change. And I think that's the challenging thing. You know, there's the deeply important personal stuff. But I think we also need stuff at the other end as well to really make sure to safeguard some things that happen on the ground.
It's a multi-headed beast.
Any questions from the audience?
Hi, thank you so much for such an engaging panel. I think it's great that you've been able to take such a difficult topic but somehow make it really inspirational. So thank you for that. I'm Ella, I'm currently a second year studying law, and you really briefly touched on legislation, and I'm really interested on how you think the role of the law kind of plays in here, and the role of lawyers, and kind of in the indigenous tribes as well, and the displacement and generally. So yeah.
So I think there are I mean, this is an area that I'm not directly familiar with. I'm just a simple vet, but there are international legal instruments that can play a key role in driving change and in safeguarding things, and actually, therefore, in putting things back in the world. So there are things like the International Labour Organization, ILO, has a resolution, I forget its number, is 167 or something, which recognises the ability of people to collectively own land, so that land ownership is not always in the name of an individual, which for indigenous peoples is critically important. It's interesting that Britain, because of the influence of Canada and Australia, has never signed up to this, despite a lot of recognition that it's a good thing globally, but because of the land ownership issues of we call First Nations people in Canada and Australia, the influence through the Commonwealth, the British have never embraced that in the way that I believe we should have done. And recently, the most recent international potential instrument is the Jakarta Resolution, which came out 2 or 3 weeks ago, which for signatories will stop them exploiting the lands of uncontacted peoples. This is a very early stage of an international agreement that I think we should try and encourage all people and companies to sign up to. And these international agreements can be the catalyst for safeguarding and for major change. And I think that the role of law internationally can be a critically important companion to the passions of individuals and grassroots organisation. And I think that in order to drive change and to safeguard what we've got still, we need both approaches in order to be most effective.
I'll just say, I mean, law can be something global, but it also can be something very local. So in this country, there was supposed to come a law to do with flooding. There was a section 3 that was specific about sustainable drainage in new developments. That every new development, which is a land use change, needs to contain the rainwater that falls on it within it and not move it downstream. It was supposed to come into effect in 2010. It didn't. It was actually conservatives who brought it back. And it went through Parliament, but hasn't been enforced yet. And it's a very simple law that will make every new development actually take this sustainable measure, will force it on them. So Cambridgeshire actually has been doing it, even though it's not a national law. But again, it's legislation. It's what can I do? I mean, this law is only about new development. What can I do about my house if I retrofit it? Can I pave my parking space outside? You know, that immediately changes the way the water runs, and it affects everything downstream from my house, through the drainage or through the nature. So legislation can actually really help us enforce and direct people in the right way.
I think to your question, how it plays a role, I think it's the utmost important thing in general, because even if international policies are being put in place, right, it's intergovernmental across borders, they will need to be implemented locally, and nationally, of course, and this will be your job at some point, for example. And I think to really have any kind of, because as long as there are no laws in place, especially the corporate world will use it and we can sit here and talk as much as we want about it. There will be other interest groups that might not care about the wasp and just go for it. So I think that is extremely important. But then there's also a different aspect to it. I think you had brought up when you said, oh, maybe climate was yesterday and now biodiversity is the new thing. If you have a company, especially here in Cambridge, for example, there are several, even in our world, that work on stem cell technologies or whatsoever. How do you implement the UN Sustainable Development Goals? Many people have never heard about them. It's always shocking to me, but it's just the faith. And there are lawyers that can help, actually, companies. Here in Cambridge, it's happening, that work at the Cambridge Conservation Institute as a lawyer, and they help companies how to implement these into their day-to-day work, but actually make them maybe even more profitable one day, not just for greenwashing, ideally. So I think there's many different roles the law does play with regard to biodiversity and climate change, actually, across everything.
I can't really add to anything to that, but your role, everybody's role, in law can be broken, but it seems once it's in place, it's set, and that law will have its day in court. If I can say that, sounds a bit bizarre, but that sense of if it's in place, then it can be shown to where people break it to pull them into line again. So really vital, not a strength of mine, but it's great that there's people considering it in their future, which is I appreciate, and thank you.
Yeah, everyone has a role to play, like really, it comes up and up. Anyone else?
Thanks for the wonderful sharing, and I got some some thoughts on the advocacy and the education part. So about advocacy, I hear some responses from the general public, like they think climate changes and our actions on it are kind of luxury because we're still struggling and feeding ourselves, right? Especially in some regions and for particular groups of people, right? Another voice is that humans are doomed to death, right? To extinction, like why we make the efforts to do that, just enjoy the moment, right? So that is another voice. I wonder like how organizations, advocates like respond to this kind of voices. And also I think I guess there's a stress on the knowledge-based advocacy, right? We know how systems functioning in the ecosystem, but sometimes people are just driven by emotions. Like maybe they just love panda or dolphin, right? And they will donate money to their protection. Maybe they don't even know what's going on in the ocean, okay? So I guess maybe there's different approaches. So how do you look at the emotional-driven campaigns or initiatives or daily practices? Yeah.
Maybe a quick one, and then you probably have a lot more to say about this. I think this is a little bit of a combination of all these things that we just said. I think the work you're doing, with especially emotionally, when you say, oh yeah, we're doomed anyway, of course, that's an easy way out. I mean, it's very likely that evolution, I mean, I don't know what the numbers are, don't quote me on this, but whenever they say, oh, 99 species of that ever existed are extinct by now, yes, I mean, why should we be not one of those? But this comes a little bit with this ethical responsibility, what I just felt, and I guess I had people like you maybe in my life that, put me on the right path when I was a child and showed me the fox crying in the backyard. I'm not sure, so I do not know the answer to this. Then there's a different aspect, I think, later in life, once we have been through the capitalistic system and all in our careers, you might have to adjust your narrative to the executive of a company. So there are, I think, these two aspects to it. But I think just giving up, for me, it's an easy way out of this debate. I'm not sure.
I don't have an answer to your question, actually, but I think it's a really important question, and I think you've hit on a couple of really important points. We are primarily emotionally driven animals, not rationally driven animals. And this is a problem for scientific communication because we've relied on people to get people to care, but the people we've relied on are scientists speaking in terms of abstract terms and statistics and numbers rather than getting people on an emotional level. I think the other thing you touched on is a recognition that if people are not engaged in this struggle, if they're choosing to remain passive, then that's an issue of social psychology. It's not because they don't know there's a problem. It's because they have put up psychological barriers, because engaging requires leaving our comfort zones. It requires doing something voluntarily that isn't required for your work or looking after your family. But it basically means choosing to engage in struggle. And there are all sorts of reasons why we might choose to protect ourselves from that difficult struggle and protect ourselves from this difficult information. There's no one answer to that, but if there's a broad answer, it's what you said. It's understanding this societal issue we have as a problem of social psychology. Just briefly on the question of doom, yes, we can't save everything. Yes, things are already really, really bad, but the idea that you can just sit this one out is a position of immense privilege. If the floodwaters are already destroying your crops, you don't have a choice to sit this one out, and neither will any of us eventually. And if your house is on fire, you don't stand outside thinking, well, I can't save everything, so I'm just going to give up. You just do what you can to save what you can, and that's the situation we're in, sadly.
Charlie, I agree with absolutely everything you've just said there. I think thinking about the university end of it, the academic end of this, I think for far too long, for all the reasons you just described, we've relied on technical solutions coming through. We're going to do some clever natural science or clever this, clever that, and I think that we should recognise within academia that if we want to drive change, often we'll get far more insight from a social science approach, which takes a real interest in understanding of people and how they react, rather than just thinking that we've got a technical solution that's going to, we'll solve this by coming up with a clever chemical or a clever agricultural solution. Actually, if we want to understand what drives people, we've got to study that directly through the social sciences rather than the kind of stuff that I do, which can be part of the solution, but it's nothing like enough.
I do feel like we have a lot of technological solutions that just need to be implemented, which is the hard part.
Can I just, audience participation, hand up who doesn't love nature? Cool. Well, no, but it's a sense. Everybody has a connection with nature, and that's where that personal comes in. People can love pandas and tigers and the Great Barrier Reef. But I always say it's the wildlife, it's the hedgehog in your garden. It's the song thrush keeping you awake in the night as it's singing, which has a far more major impact. And so if you can engage again with the local wildlife, then people can, if they're shut off from, people don't go on holidays to car parks. Even lying on a beach has nature there. Maybe not a pool, but it's that sense of people have that connection. It's just supporting them to realise that and knowing that they can see it as valuable. It's not just pollinating your crops or stopping flooding going on. It's the day-to-day enjoyment of life. If I didn't... I was overjoyed last year. I saw a hedgehog outside my garden for the first time in 8 years. When I was a kid, 2 or 3 in the garden throughout the summer. And it's that ability to see that where you can connect with stuff and where the positive happens is really key. And connecting that with everybody. I rambled a bit then, sorry.
I agree with everything that was just said. And I come very much hardcore from the technological side of things, right? And it's true that even if you implement them, my biggest concern, as I mentioned before, is always what if we do something wrong? We don't want to do that either. But also, I think it's more like a tool in the toolbox. And when I say I've been reading now these articles that have been written for decades, very little has changed, and we have all the technologies available, and lots of the conservation tools actually are working, the existing ones, and yet we are not using them to the extent we could be using them. And I think there you're absolutely right. It's a human aspect that could be implemented way more. So if we use this emotional driven aspect of bringing the society to the point of caring and actually using what is already out there in addition to potentially novel technologies that might or might not assist conservation efforts, then we would probably be better off than where we are now.
We're running out of time.
Sorry, I'll just say capitalism again. That's the other thing. That's the major driver. So much social science, but capitalism, they have so much trillions against us in the fight. David and Goliath kind of, or a non-gender specific equivalent is where we are. But I was thinking just the other day, in anticipation of this, how I got the courage from a very young age to do stuff. I don't know whether people know Dr. Seuss, Horton Hears a Who. I know there's certain issues with Dr. Seuss and it's certain aspects of it which are difficult at this time, in this day and age, but I'd recommend reading Horton Hears a Who. It's fantastic.
Yeah, more questions on the networking later. And I just wanted to say thank you so much for digesting this very complex problem and situation so well. I really feel very informed. Thank you so much.
So thank you all so much for coming to panel 1. In terms of the order of business, I'd like to mention again the panel 2 that we have at 1:30, the round table at 4 o'clock, and then the networking with drinks and nibbles at 6 o'clock. All of that's in here. So basically, you can treat Newnham as your home, more or less, for the day if you're available. We're going to have a little bit of buffer time in between the events so we can sort of set the room and stuff, but the Iris Cafe is a minute's walk if you want to grab lunch, grab a snack. Obviously, there'll be some complimentary drinks at the networking event and at the round table as well. But thank you so much to our wonderful panel, and we look forward to seeing you, unless there's anything else I've written down I need to say. Oh, yes. There's some wonderful materials at the back from the Wildlife Trust, so some magazines, some cards. Please feel free to make maximum use of that and get involved. And yeah, so that's all. So look forward to seeing you after lunch at 1:30 in here. Thank you very much.